Ivy Sullivan stepped onto the marble floor of the grand mansion, her modest uniform feeling starkly out of place against the swirling silk gowns and tailored tuxedos of the guests. The air was thick with whispered conversations mingled with the soft clink of crystal glasses, all under the glow of glittering chandeliers. She clutched her cleaning supplies tightly, keeping her head down, determined to do her job without drawing attention. The mansion belonged to the renowned art collector, Mr. Hargrove, and tonight's gala promised to be an impressive display of wealth and culture. Ivy moved quietly through the rooms, dusting shelves adorned with delicate porcelain and rare artifacts with careful hands. She was used to working behind the scenes, invisible to the glittering elite whose lives she tidied. Suddenly, a shocked gasp echoed from the main hall. Ivy's heart jumped as she hurried toward the sound, only to see a crowd gathered around the shattered remains of an exquisite marble sculpture. Its jagged edges glistened beneath the warm light, a painful contrast to the once elegant figure it had been. Across the room, Mr. Hargrove's son, Julian, stepped forward, his voice sharp and accusing. "Ivy, you were the only one in the gallery alone. You must have knocked it over while cleaning." The guests shifted uneasily, some sneering, others murmuring with thinly veiled scorn. Ivy felt their eyes burn into her simple clothes and downcast expression. The words hung heavy, unfair, and cruel. Before she could speak, Mr. Hargrove's voice cut through the room. "Ivy, please gather your things. We cannot have carelessness here." She was dismissed in a cold sweep, her protests swallowed by the sea of judgment. Head bowed, heartbreaking, Ivy left the mansion, certain she had done no wrong. Ivy closed the door of her small apartment behind her with a slow, trembling hand. The familiar scent of worn fabric and faint traces of lavender rose from the single potted plant on her windowsill, but tonight, the room felt stifling, suffocating. She leaned against the door for a moment, eyes closed, willing herself not to break down. The humiliation from the mansion still stung sharply, like a fresh wound. She walked to the kitchenette, poured a glass of water, but didn't drink. The tight knot in her stomach squeezed her appetite away. Ivy sat on the edge of the worn couch, her mind a whirl of confused, festering emotions, anger, disbelief, shame. How had she been so quickly accused? How had a room full of people who barely knew her accepted the story without hesitation? Even Mr. Hargrove, the owner she respected, did not defend her. She had been fired just like that, dismissed as careless, thoughtless, clumsy. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from a coworker checking in. She ignored it. She wasn't ready to explain or relive the night. The words carelessness and accident echoed cruelly in her ears. She felt crushed beneath the weight of their judgment. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and broken. Night after night, her mind replayed the scenes in an endless loop: the gleaming marble, the sudden crash, Julian's accusing glare, the cold dismissal. She saw her own hands, carefully dusting the sculpture moments before it broke. She had been careful, meticulous, always cautious around the priceless works. She had never touched it in a way that could cause harm. The days that followed were harder still. Lack of work meant bills piled up quickly, rent due and unpaid, a mounting pressure that tightened around her chest. Friends and neighbors who once nodded kindly now looked past her like she was invisible or worse, a cautionary tale whispered about behind closed doors. Ivy withdrew into herself, speaking little and retreating from what was left of her small social circle. Silence filled her tiny rooms, a stark contrast to the elegant halls she'd left behind. The loneliness gnawed at her, threatening to swallow her whole. She found it nearly impossible to eat. Even the few simple meals she managed to prepare sat untouched on the table, cold and uninviting. Every bite felt heavy, like swallowing the bitter taste of betrayal. Amid the sorrow, her mind wandered back to another life, a different version of herself. She closed her eyes and remembered the days when art was not a distant aspiration but her world. Ivy Sullivan had once been an art restoration student, accepted into a prestigious program but forced to leave early. Her mother's illness had come swiftly, and Ivy had chosen family over career without hesitation. Images flashed before her, the bright studio filled with sunlight streaming through tall windows, the meticulous brushstrokes as she worked to repair a faded painting, the satisfying smell of encaustic wax melting under her fingertip. She had been devoted, talented even, praised quietly by her instructors. But at 18, when her mother's diagnosis came, everything changed. The care and nursing of a sick parent left no room for school, no time or money for art studies. She recalled the endless hospital visits, the nights sitting by her mother's bedside, the gradual fading of vitality that left a hollow ache inside her. The sacrifices had seemed endless at the time, but now she felt them keenly, as if she had given up intimate pieces of herself. Her dreams had slipped through her fingers like fine dust. After her mother's passing, Ivy struggled to rebuild her life. Without a diploma or steady employment, she took cleaning and housekeeping jobs to make ends meet. Each job was a stepping stone, a chance to save a little and hold her head up. When the position at Mr. Hargrove's mansion became available, she had grasped it firmly. It was more than just a paycheck, it felt like a connection to the world she once loved. She had hoped to be close, even in a small way, to the world of art again. Now, that hope lay shattered with the broken sculpture. She thought of the careful hours she spent wiping marble, of treating each object with reverence, aware of their fragility. The accusation felt like a personal blow, not just to her work ethic but to her very identity. She regretted nothing, yet the dissonance between who she was and how she was seen by others grew. Ivy was the quiet, diligent woman who barely spoke at parties, who moved through rooms dust-laden and unnoticed. To the wealthy guests, she was an outsider, someone easily blamed for mishaps. The contrast between her past dreams and her present circumstances deepened the ache. Tears came unbidden, but she swallowed them, unwilling to let despair claim her entirely. Yet, beneath the exhaustion and shame, a small flame of resolve began to flicker. Ivy remembered how she had always confronted challenges with calm determination, how she had persevered when life demanded more than she thought she could give. Somewhere, beyond the hit to her pride and the weight of injustice, she sensed that this wasn't the end. The chance to clear her name might be buried beneath layers of scorn, but it was not beyond reach. She glanced once more at the shattered sculpture frozen in her memory, a symbol not of failure but of the injustice done. Ivy knew she had to find a way to prove her innocence. Not for the mansion, or the guests, but for herself, the woman who had given up so much and deserved better than this cold dismissal. Her story was not finished. The fight to reclaim her dignity was only beginning. The following Thursday evening, Ivy wiped her hands on an old dish towel while standing at the small kitchen sink of her apartment. The residue of soap bubbles sparkled in the dim light. As she rinsed the last plate, a sudden memory struck her, a snippet of conversation she had overheard just before the gala began that night. She had been dusting near the gallery room when two guests, standing discreetly in the hallway, exchanged quiet words. One had said, "The sculpture's base looks precarious. Julian always insists it's stable, but it's so fragile." The other replied sharply, "Don't underestimate him. He's reckless. If that thing falls, better it doesn't ruin his perfect night." Ivy had absorbed their whispers but dismissed them then, focused on her work. Now, that detail gnawed at her, a nagging feeling of something overlooked, a crack in the story that Julian had spun so confidently. Determined to seek some form of clarity, she called the mansion's manager, Mr. Ashford, a rigid man known for his formal demeanor. After reaching his office number, Ivy hesitated only a moment before speaking softly, "Mr. Ashford, this is Ivy Sullivan. I wanted to ask if I might speak with you. There's something important about the sculpture incident I need to explain. The line was silent for a tense moment. Then Mr. Ashford's cool voice replied, Ivy, I'm aware of your situation. However, the matter has been settled with Mr. Hargrove, and there's nothing more to discuss. I advise you to let this go. Frustration threatened to bubble into anger, but Ivy kept her voice level. Please, sir. I only wish for a chance to be heard. I was not responsible for the damage. Respectfully, Ivy, my decision stands. The line went dead. The rejection felt like a physical blow. Still, Ivy refused to let the matter rest unresolved. If official doors were closed, perhaps there was another way. She returned to the mansion 2 nights later, this time during the mansion's quieter hours, posing as a nearby neighbor out for a stroll. The grand gates shimmered in the moonlight as she walked the path leading to the guarded entrance. The security booth was manned by a younger man named Ethan, whom Ivy had quietly befriended during past shifts when their brief exchanges were warm and friendly. Ivy, he said with a nod of recognition, surprise flickering in his eyes. What are you doing here? I need your help, Ethan, she said softly, her voice thick with hope. I know I was blamed unfairly. Do you think there's any way to prove who really knocked over the sculpture? Ethan paused, then glanced around cautiously. There are hidden microphones in a few rooms. Mr. Hargrove installed them last year, mostly for security during big events. He hesitated. I guess there might be recordings from the night of the gala. Ivy's heart pulsed at the possibility. Is there a way we can listen to them? She asked. I don't have direct access, Ethan said. But I could check the system logs. If the recording from that night still exists, maybe I can arrange a moment for you to hear it. Relief and nervous excitement spiked inside Ivy. After a tense wait, Ethan led her into the quiet security office, the walls lined with monitors showing various angles of the mansion. He pulled up the audio files, fingers deftly navigating the equipment. They settled near the speakers, the room heavy with silence as the first faint murmurs filled the air. The recording began with the ambient sounds of the gala, footsteps, laughter, clinking glasses. Then clearer voices emerged. Julian's voice was unmistakable, a confident sneer in his tone as he spoke to a small group. Watch this. The sculpture can't stand a bump, but no one's going to blame me if it goes. Then a sudden thud on marble, followed by a sharp gasp. Oops, Julian muttered, his voice shaky. A whispered overtone of panic crept in. The recording picked up footsteps approaching rapidly. This isn't good, we need a scapegoat, Julian whispered acerbically. Ivy was the only one near it cleaning, she'll take the fall. The audio exposed the son's careless handling and immediate decision to blame Ivy. Ivy's breath hitched. The raw evidence was undeniable, her innocence recorded in clear sound. Tears welled in her eyes, a mix of vindication and bitter sorrow. The truth was finally within reach, yet she also felt the heavy burden of what had passed, the unfair judgment until now. Ethan looked at her sympathetically. This could change everything, you have what you need. Ivy nodded, gripping the edge of the table, steadied by a newfound resolve. She had proof. Now, she had to decide how to share it, without the mansion turning its back on her again. Days later, the grand mansion was preparing once more for a special event, a private preview of new art acquisitions arranged by Mr. Hargrove himself. The lavish halls gleamed under polished chandeliers, and the elite guests arrived in their designer gowns and sharp suits, conversations buzzing with expectation and whispered accolades. Ivy Sullivan walked quietly beside the entrance, her simple attire drawing glances of surprise and curiosity. She hadn't been invited, but this event was the perfect opportunity to confront the silence and clear her name. Clutching her phone securely in her pocket, Ivy steeled herself as she stepped into the main hall. The familiar scent of polished wood and aged limestone filled the air. Fine art surrounded her, but her focus remained sharp. Tonight's goal was to reveal the truth to those who had condemned her without question. The room buzzed with chatter as Julian Hargrove took center stage near the shattered sculpture's display pedestal, now replaced by a similar piece, wearing a confident smirk. He addressed a cluster of patrons eagerly, recounting tales of the gala night, portraying himself as the unintended victim of an unfortunate accident blamed unfairly on a housekeeper. Ivy listened quietly at a distance, heart pounding but face calm. When the moment felt right, she moved forward, holding up her phone. "Excuse me," she said clearly, voice calm and unwavering over the murmur. Conversations faltered, and dozens of eyes turned toward the modest woman who dared interrupt the festivities. Clearing her throat, Ivy pressed play. The room filled with the unmistakable voices recorded during the gala, the laughter, the confident boasting of Julian admitting to accidentally knocking over the sculpture, followed by the panicked plotting to blame her. The audio was crisp and undeniable. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Faces shifted, whispered comments began to ripple through the gathered guests. Julian's smirk faltered, his eyes darting nervously as panic seeped into his posture. He tried to laugh nervously, casting glances toward his father's study, but the damage was done. Mr. Ashford, the mansion manager, approached, his brow furrowed in surprise, then tightened in disapproval at the son. "This recording, it contradicts what we have been told. Julian, please explain." Julian's voice lost its edge. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for anyone to get blamed. I panicked." The crowd's demeanor shifted swiftly. The subtle judgment and prejudice that had weighed on Ivy before transformed into audible murmurs of sympathy for her. Several guests exchanged looks of quiet regret, realizing they had been quick to believe the privileged son over the innocent housekeeper. Ivy stood with quiet dignity, watching the scene unfold. The once imposing figure of Julian was now shrinking under the crowd's scrutiny, his earlier arrogance replaced by desperation. The scales of social power teetered, the whispered assurances of his innocence unraveling with each passing moment. A few influential patrons approached Ivy, offering quiet apologies and words of support. One elderly woman, a respected art patron, nodded sincerely. "Thank you for your courage, Miss Sullivan. It's time the truth was heard." Through the evening's crescendo of shifting alliances, whispered regrets, and sudden revelations, Ivy remained calm, no longer the invisible, assumed culprit but a woman whose truth could not be silenced. By the event's close, the atmosphere had transformed. The mansion's patrons now regarded Ivy with respect rather than suspicion, their collective judgment overturned in the space of a few minutes. As the crowd began to disperse, the mansion owner, Mr. Hargrove, approached Ivy. His expression was a mixture of apology and acknowledgement. "Miss Sullivan, I regret that we did not listen sooner. You have my deepest apologies." Ivy inclined her head slightly, her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. I'm glad the truth was finally told." The night's events left Ivy feeling a flicker of hope she had not dared to feel in days. The humiliation that had weighed so heavily was now being lifted piece by piece, replaced by a sense of justice quietly reclaimed. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, the scales of judgment had tilted, opening doors she had thought forever closed. With her dignity intact and the mansion's support beginning to return, Ivy stepped into the cool night air outside the grand estate. The once dismissive glances of strangers now held a different light, the first glimmers of respect. She straightened her shoulders and walked forward, quietly triumphant, no longer unseen, no longer silenced. The days that followed the gallery event felt like a turning tide sweeping through the grand mansion's corridors. The son, Julian Hargrove, who once held himself with an unshakable confidence, had become a figure sidestepped by service staff and met with cold, questioning eyes by guests who once admired him. The revelation of his careless act and his deliberate blame on Ivy Sullivan was no longer a secret swept under lavish rugs. Mr. Hargrove himself, the collector and patriarch, moved swiftly to contain the damage. The news of Julian's misconduct had reached patrons beyond the mansion's walls, threatening the reputation of the Hargrove Art Gallery and their social standing. Julian was officially severed from his roles in the family's art ventures and barred from participating in upcoming events. The formal announcement came via a crisp letter from Mr. Ashford, the mansion's manager, who seemed to carry the weight of the family's disappointment with a dispassionate efficiency. Meanwhile, Ivy received an unexpected call one afternoon. "Miss Sullivan?" Mr. Ashford's tone was more respectful now. "Mr. Hargrove and I would like to meet with you. We deeply regret the misunderstanding and wish to offer you reinstatement." Ivy sat silently, the voice resonating with sincerity. Her past weeks had been a tumult of despair and resolve, and this moment felt surreal. When she returned to the mansion, the heavy doors parted to reveal not just the familiar opulence but a new atmosphere, one tinged with apology and acknowledgement. Mr. Hargrove greeted her with a grave sincerity. "Ivy, your integrity has been proven beyond doubt. I would like you to come back, not just as housekeeper but with the added role of assisting our art restoration team part-time. Your skills and passion are assets we cannot overlook." The offer was both unexpected and affirming. Ivy's eyes glistened with a quiet appreciation for the second chance, a whispered acknowledgement of the talent set aside so long ago. As she settled back into her role, the mansion began to feel less like a place of judgment and more like a stage where her worth was beginning to be recognized. Colleagues who once avoided her now exchanged nods of respect, and even Ethan, the security guard who had quietly supported her, smiled with warmth. The day Julian was formally barred from entering the premises was marked by a somber meeting attended by the mansion staff and patrons. His flair for dramatics was absent, the boy who boasted and belittled appeared diminished, facing the consequences without resistance. It was a public shaming of sorts, but it bore no bitterness from Ivy, only a calm satisfaction that justice, slow but certain, had found its way. The mansion's elite, who once whispered behind Ivy's back, now spoke of her with admiration. Some even advocated on her behalf for her promotion, recognizing her courage and integrity. An invitation arrived unexpectedly, an offer to attend a prestigious art workshop sponsored by a renowned philanthropic foundation. Ivy considered it a remarkable opportunity, one that rekindled the dreams she once had buried beneath years of sacrifice. At the next grand gathering in the mansion, Mr. Hargrove made a point of publicly apologizing to Ivy. His voice carried the weight of genuine remorse as he addressed the assembled guests. "Tonight, we honor not just the art on these walls, but the character of those who serve and cherish it. Ivy Sullivan exemplifies dedication and courage. Let us all learn from her example." Ivy accepted the apology with grace, a small smile touching her lips. She felt the invisible chains of past blame break free at last. As she left the event later that evening, the cool night air wrapped around her like a balm. Her steps were sure and steady along the mansion's long stone path, her head held high against a sky dotted with stars. No longer the quiet, simple housekeeper dismissed hastily, Ivy Sullivan walked forward embraced by respect and newfound confidence. She carried with her not just the vindication of the broken sculpture's truth but the reclamation of her own story, a tale not defined by blame, but by resilience, dignity, and the courage to be seen.